The parking lot of Riverside Community Center was packed tighter than usual on that chilly October evening. Cars squeezed into every available space, with some folks having to park 3 blocks away and walk back. Inside the building, warm yellow, lights spilled through tall windows and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted out every time someone opened the front doors. Beverly stepped out of her old Honda Civic, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. This wasn't her scene at all. The annual talent showcase was something she'd heard about but never attended. Most of the people who came to these events lived in the newer part of town, where the houses had 2-car garages and perfectly trimmed hedges. Beverly lived 15 minutes away in a neighborhood where kids played basketball until the streetlights came on, and everyone knew their neighbor's business. But tonight was different. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had practically begged her to come, watch her 10-year-old daughter Lisa perform. The little girl had been practicing violin for months, and this was her first time performing in front of a real audience. Mrs. Chen was nervous and wanted a friendly face in the crowd. Beverly couldn't say no to that sweet old lady who always brought her homemade soup when she was sick. Walking toward the entrance, Beverly noticed the types of cars in the parking lot: shiny SUVs, luxury sedans, and even a few sports cars. Her 15-year-old Honda with the small dent in the bumper definitely stood out. She took a deep breath and reminded herself she was here for Lisa, not to fit in with anyone else. The moment she stepped inside, Beverly felt that familiar feeling she'd experienced countless times before. Heads turned, conversations paused for just a split second. It wasn't anything dramatic or obvious, but she noticed. Being one of the few black faces in a room full of white folks always made her hyper-aware of every glance, every pause in conversation. The community center had been decorated beautifully for the event. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, and small tables were scattered around with white tablecloths and simple flower arrangements. A makeshift stage had been set up at one end of the room, with microphones and speakers that looked like they'd been borrowed from the local high school. The whole setup had that charming, slightly chaotic feel of a volunteer-run event. Beverly found an empty chair near the back, close to the wall. She preferred spots where she could see everything but didn't draw attention to herself. From her seat, she could watch the performers and also keep an eye on the door in case she needed to leave early. Old habits from a lifetime of being the only one who looked like her in various rooms. The evening was already in full swing. A middle-aged man with a guitar had just finished singing what sounded like a folk song about lost love. A group of teenagers performed a dance routine that was enthusiastic if not perfectly synchronized. Then came Lisa, looking tiny behind her violin, her black hair perfectly braided and tied with a yellow ribbon. Beverly's heart warmed as she watched the little girl concentrate intensely, her small fingers moving carefully across the strings. The piece wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt, and that's what mattered. As the evening continued, Beverly found herself genuinely enjoying the performances. There was something beautiful about watching people share their talents, even if they weren't professional quality. A woman sang opera with a voice that filled the entire room. Twin brothers played harmonica together, creating harmonies that made everyone smile. An elderly gentleman told jokes that had the whole crowd laughing, even though half of them were probably older than Beverly's grandfather. During a brief intermission, people got up to stretch their legs and grab refreshments from a table laden with homemade cookies and coffee in styrofoam cups. Beverly stayed in her seat, content to people watch and occasionally nod hello to folks who made eye contact. That's when she noticed them. 4 college-aged kids were clustered near the refreshment table, stealing glances in her direction. They looked like they were probably home from university for the weekend, volunteering at their parents' community event. 2 guys and 2 girls, all wearing the kind of casual, expensive clothes that tried to look effortless, but probably cost more than Beverly's monthly grocery budget. At first, Beverly thought they were just curious. Sometimes young people stared, because they weren't used to seeing diversity in their hometown events. She'd learned not to take it personally. But then she noticed the whispers, the quick glances followed by heads huddled together, the barely contained smirks and nudges with elbows. Beverly had seen this movie before. She knew that look, that energy. These kids were cooking up something, and she had a pretty good idea she was going to be the main ingredient. Sure enough, After a few more minutes of whispered conversation and stifled giggles, one of the girls started walking toward her. She was blonde, probably around 20, with the kind of confident stride that came from never having to question whether she belonged somewhere. The others followed a few steps behind, trying to look casual but clearly invested in whatever was about to happen. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice dripping with the kind of exaggerated politeness that immediately put Beverly on guard. "Hi there. I'm Jessica, and these are my friends. We're helping organize tonight's event." Beverly nodded politely but didn't say anything. Experience had taught her to let people show their cards before she revealed hers. "We noticed you sitting by yourself and thought you might want to participate in the talent show," Jessica continued, her smile getting bigger and more artificial by the second. "I mean, if you have any talents you'd like to share with everyone." The way she said talents made Beverly's jaw tighten slightly. There was something in the tone, something that suggested these kids had already decided what kind of talent someone like her might have. "That's very kind," Beverly replied carefully. "But I'm just here to watch. I'm supporting a friend's daughter." "Oh, come on," one of the boys chimed in, stepping forward with an encouraging grin. "Don't be shy. Everyone's been so brave tonight sharing their gifts. I bet you have something special to offer." Beverly could feel the conversation heading exactly where she expected it to go. These kids thought they were being clever, but their game was older than they were. "Well," Jessica said, clasping her hands together like she'd just had the most wonderful idea. "We have this piano over there in the corner. It's been sitting there all evening and nobody's played it yet. Would you like to give it a try?" Beverly's eyes followed Jessica's gesture to a beaten-up upright piano pushed against the far wall. Even from across the room she could see it. Had seen better days. The wood was scratched and faded. Several keys looked like they stuck when pressed, and Beverly would bet money it hadn't been tuned in years, maybe decades. The 4 college kids stood there waiting for her response, their faces masks of innocent encouragement, but Beverly could see right through them. They thought they'd found an easy target for their little joke. The black woman sitting alone probably doesn't know any better. Let's see what happens when we put her in front of that broken-down piano. They were probably already imagining the embarrassing sounds that would come out, the uncomfortable moment they could laugh about later. Beverly looked at the piano, then back at the 4 expectant faces. She could feel other people in the room, starting to notice the interaction. Conversations were getting quieter as folks began to tune in to whatever was happening near the back of the room. She had a choice to make. Beverly stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. The 4 college kids waited with their fake smiles, clearly expecting her to either make an excuse and decline, or maybe get flustered and embarrassed. Either way, they figured they'd get their entertainment for the evening. But Beverly had been playing this game a lot longer than they had. She looked past them toward the old piano again. From where she sat, she could see dust particles floating in the light above the keys. One of the pedals was missing its cover, and the bench looked like it might wobble if someone sat on it wrong. It was exactly the kind of setup these kids thought would make her look foolish. "You know what?" Beverly said, standing up slowly and smoothing down her sweater. "That sounds like a lovely idea." The confidence in her voice caught them off guard for just a moment. Jessica's smile flickered, and one of the boys exchanged a quick glance with his friend. They'd expected her to be nervous or uncertain, not calm and collected. "Oh, wonderful." Jessica recovered quickly, clapping her hands together. "How exciting. Everyone's going to love this." As Beverly started walking toward the piano, she could feel the energy in the room shifting. Conversations weren't stopping completely, but they were getting quieter. People were starting to notice something was happening. A few folks had turned in their chairs to get a better view. Beverly took her time walking across the room. She wasn't in any hurry, and she wanted to think about what was really happening here. These kids thought they were pulling a prank, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a middle-aged black woman sitting alone and made assumptions about what she could or couldn't do. It was a story as old as time, and Beverly had lived through versions of it more times than she could count. When she reached the piano, Beverly ran her hand along the top of it, feeling the scratches and dents in the wood. This old thing had definitely seen better days. She lifted the lid that covered the keys, and it creaked loud enough for people nearby to hear. Some of the keys were definitely sticking, and a few looked like they might not make any sound at all. The bench was indeed wobbly, just like she'd suspected. Beverly tested it carefully before sitting down, adjusting her position until she found the most stable spot. She could hear the college kids whispering behind her, probably making comments about how this was going to be good. Beverly placed her hands on the keys and pressed a few of them gently, just to see what she was working with. Sure enough, 3 keys in the middle range produced no sound at all. 2 keys in the upper register stuck halfway down and had to be coaxed back up. The whole instrument was probably a full half-step flat, maybe more. She could feel more eyes on her now. The room wasn't completely quiet yet, but it was getting there. Some people were still chatting with their neighbors, but others had definitely tuned in to see what was about to happen. Beverly caught sight of Mrs. Chen across the room, looking a bit worried. The sweet old lady probably sensed something was up but couldn't quite figure out what. Beverly cracked her knuckles quietly and rolled her shoulders to loosen them up. It had been a while since she'd played in front of people, but her body remembered the routine, the preparation, the moment of quiet before the music began. Behind her, she could hear one of the college boys whisper something to his friends, followed by muffled laughter. They thought this was going to be their big joke of the evening. The funny story they'd tell their friends back at school about the time they got some random lady to embarrass herself on a broken piano. Beverly had news for them. She tested a few more keys, figuring out exactly which ones worked and which ones didn't. In her mind, she was already adapting, already hearing how she could work around the piano's limitations. A broken instrument didn't mean broken music. It just meant getting creative. The room was definitely getting quieter now. Beverly could sense more people turning their attention toward the piano corner. Someone's conversation about weekend plans trailed off mid-sentence. A woman who'd been laughing loudly at her friend's story suddenly lowered her voice. Beverly adjusted her position on the wobbly bench one more time and placed her hands in the proper starting position. Her fingers found their places on the keys like they were coming home after a long trip. It had been months since she'd played anything more complicated than Happy Birthday for a neighbor's kid, but her hands remembered exactly where they belonged. She could practically feel the anticipation radiating from the college kids behind her. They were probably fighting to keep straight faces, maybe even getting their phones ready to record what they expected to be an awkward moment they could share later. The thing was, Beverly had been underestimated before. Many times. She'd walked into rooms where people took one look at her and decided they knew exactly what she was capable of. She'd sat through job interviews where she could see the surprise in people's faces when she opened her mouth and demonstrated knowledge they hadn't expected her to have. She'd been in countless situations where folks made assumptions about her background, her education, her abilities, based on nothing more than what they saw on the surface. Most of the time, Beverly just went about her business and let her work speak for itself. She didn't make a big deal out of proving people wrong. But every once in a while, when the situation called for it, she didn't mind giving folks a gentle reminder about the dangers of judging books by their covers. Tonight felt like one of those times. The room had gotten noticeably quieter now. Beverly could hear individual conversations instead of the general buzz of crowd noise she'd been hearing all evening. Someone coughed. A chair creaked as someone shifted to get a better view. The anticipation was building, though people didn't quite know what they were anticipating. Beverly took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She could feel her heartbeat, steady and calm. This feeling was familiar. The moment right before the music began, when everything else faded away and it was just her and the keys and whatever was about to come through her fingers. She glanced back once at the 4 college kids who were standing there trying to look encouraging while barely containing their excitement about the show they thought they were about to see. Jessica gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up. One of the boys mouthed, "You've got this," with an expression that was probably meant to be supportive but came across as condescending. Beverly turned back to the piano and smiled to herself. These kids had no idea what was coming. The room held its breath as Beverly positioned her fingers on the keys, ready to show everyone exactly what assumptions could cost you. Some phones had indeed come out, held discreetly by people who thought they might catch something worth sharing. The college kids were practically vibrating with anticipation behind her. Beverly's fingers hovered over the keys for one more moment, feeling the weight of the room's attention. Then, with the slightest smile playing at the corners of her mouth, she began to play. The first notes that came from Beverly's fingers weren't what anyone expected. Instead of the clunky, amateur sounds the college kids were waiting for, something magical began filling the room. Beverly started with a soft, gentle melody that seemed to float through the air like morning mist. Her right hand picked out a simple but beautiful tune while her left hand found the working bass keys, creating a foundation that made the whole piano sound richer than it had any right to. The broken keys that should have ruined everything became part of the music instead. Where a note was supposed to ring out but couldn't, Beverly simply paused, letting the silence become part of the rhythm. It was like she was having a conversation with the old piano, working with its limitations instead of fighting against them. Jessica's confident smile started to fade as she realized this wasn't going the way she'd planned. The boy next to her stopped recording on his phone and just stared. This wasn't the embarrassing moment they'd been expecting to capture. Beverly's fingers danced across the keys with a grace that made it look effortless, even though she was constantly adapting to which keys worked and which didn't. When she hit a key that stuck, she incorporated the slight delay into the timing. When a key produced no sound at all, she made the silence feel intentional, like it belonged there. The conversations in the room began dying away completely now. People who had been half listening while chatting with friends found themselves turning their full attention to the corner where this unexpected performance was unfolding. A woman who'd been checking her phone put it away and leaned forward in her chair. A man who'd been getting up to refill his coffee cup sat back down without taking his eyes off Beverly. What Beverly was playing wasn't just technically impressive. It was deeply moving. The melody seemed to tell a story without words. It spoke of long days and quiet strength, of dreams that had been put aside but never forgotten, of finding beauty in unexpected places. Every note carried emotion that reached right into people's hearts. Mrs. Chen, who had been worried about what was happening, now had tears forming in her eyes. She'd known Beverly was special, but she'd never heard her play like this. Little Lisa, fresh off her own violin performance, stood next to her mother with her mouth hanging open, watching Beverly's hands move across the keys like they were painting music in the air. The college kids behind Beverly had gone completely silent. Their whispered jokes and barely contained laughter had evaporated. Jessica was staring at Beverly's back with an expression that had shifted from smug anticipation to growing horror as she realized what they'd actually done. They hadn't set up an embarrassing prank. They'd accidentally given a master musician a stage. Beverly transitioned smoothly from her opening piece into something that had echoes of classical training, but felt more personal, more soulful. Her left hand walked up and down the bass keys that still worked, creating a rhythm that made people want to sway in their seats. Her right hand told the main story, weaving melodies that seemed to pull emotions out of thin air. The broken piano, which had been destined for the dumpster next week, suddenly sounded like it belonged in a concert hall. Beverly was bringing out tones and textures that nobody knew it still had in it. She found the sweet spots on keys that had seemed completely dead, coaxing sound out of them with just the right touch and timing. An elderly gentleman near the front of the room had stopped pretending to read the program and was openly staring at Beverly with amazement. He'd played piano himself for 60 years, and even he couldn't figure out how she was making that beat-up old instrument sound so beautiful. The technical skill was obvious, but there was something else happening here, something that went beyond just knowing how to hit the right keys. Beverly's music began shifting again, this time into something that sounded like it came from deep Southern churches and Sunday morning services. But it wasn't exactly gospel, and it wasn't exactly blues, and it wasn't exactly jazz. It was all of those things and none of them, blended together into something uniquely her own. Her hands seemed to be having their own conversation, the left hand asking questions that the right hand would answer, back and forth like old friends sharing stories. People in the room who'd never been moved by piano music before found themselves completely absorbed. A teenager who usually only listened to hip-hop was nodding his head to Beverly's rhythm. A woman who claimed she didn't understand classical music felt her heart racing as Beverly built toward what seemed like it might be a climax. The 4 college students were experiencing something none of them had bargained for. What started as a mean-spirited joke was turning into one of the most beautiful things they'd ever heard. Jessica's face had gone pale as the reality of what they'd tried to do began sinking in. They'd seen a black woman sitting alone and assumed she'd be an easy target for their entertainment. Now she was showing them exactly how wrong and cruel their assumptions had been. Beverly seemed completely unaware of the drama happening behind her. She was lost in the music now, her whole body moving slightly with the rhythm she was creating. Her fingers found notes that shouldn't have worked on that broken piano, but somehow did. She made the instrument's flaws disappear. Or maybe she made them part of the beauty instead. The piece she was playing now had elements that sounded almost like a lullaby, gentle and comforting. But underneath there was strength that reminded everyone listening that quiet didn't mean weak. Beverly's music was telling the story of someone who'd faced challenges and come through them not bitter, but wise. Someone who'd learned to find joy even when things weren't perfect. Phones had come out all over the room now, but not to record something embarrassing. People were capturing something extraordinary. The community center's director, who'd been managing the sound system from the back, had stopped everything she was doing and moved closer to get a better view. She'd hosted dozens of these talent shows over the years, but she'd never seen anything like this. Beverly's hands moved to a section of the keyboard where several keys didn't work at all, and instead of avoiding that area, she made the broken keys part of the music. She'd hit a working key. Then where a broken key should have sounded, she'd pause, letting the silence ring out before moving to the next working note. It created a rhythm that was haunting and beautiful, like music with holes in it that somehow made it more perfect, not less. The room had gone completely silent except for Beverly's playing. Even the people working in the kitchen had stopped what they were doing and come out to listen. A little boy who'd been running around all evening was sitting perfectly still in his mother's lap, completely mesmerized by the sounds coming from the corner. Beverly began building toward something bigger now, her music growing fuller and more complex. Both hands were working together to create layers of sound that seemed impossible on such a damaged instrument. She was showing everyone in that room that talent doesn't need perfect conditions to shine. Sometimes the most beautiful art comes from working with what you have and making it extraordinary. The college kid stood frozen behind her, finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake. Beverly's music continued to fill every corner of the community center, but now something even more powerful was happening. The sound she was creating went beyond just notes and melodies. It was touching something deep inside every person in that room, reaching places they didn't even know existed. A woman in her 70s who'd been knitting quietly in the back row all evening had put down her needles completely. Tears were streaming down her cheeks as Beverly's music reminded her of her late husband, who used to play piano for their church choir 50 years ago. She hadn't heard anything that beautiful since he passed away, and for a moment it felt like he was right there in the room with her. The teenage boy who'd been scrolling through social media on his phone had put the device away entirely. He was leaning forward in his chair, completely captivated by what he was hearing. Music like this wasn't supposed to exist in his world of streaming playlists and earbuds. But here it was, live and real and more powerful than anything he'd ever experienced through his headphones. Beverly seemed to sense the energy in the room changing. Her playing became even more expressive, like she was feeding off the attention and emotion of her audience. She moved into a section that sounded like pure joy, her fingers dancing across the working keys with such speed and precision that people could barely follow the movement. But even as she played the most technically challenging passages, she never forgot about the broken keys, incorporating their silence into the rhythm like they were meant to be there all along. The 4 college students were experiencing something none of them knew how to process. Jessica's hands were shaking slightly as she watched Beverly play. The cruel joke they'd planned was backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of embarrassing Beverly, they'd given her a platform to showcase talent that was clearly professional level. Instead of getting a laugh at her expense, they were being forced to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. One of the boys, who'd been the most enthusiastic about the prank, was staring at Beverly with his mouth slightly open. He'd grown up in this community, attended the local high school, thought he knew everyone worth knowing. How had someone this talented been living 15 minutes away without him ever hearing about her? The question was making him realize how small and limited his world really was. Beverly transitioned into something that sounded like it belonged in a movie soundtrack, building tension and then releasing it in waves of beautiful sound. Her left hand was creating a bass line that seemed to pulse with life, while her right hand painted melodies that soared above it like birds in flight. The broken piano was singing under her touch, producing music that none of the expensive instruments in the local music stores could have created, because they lacked the character that came from years of wear and imperfection. Mrs. Chen was openly crying now, not from sadness, but from pure emotion. She'd invited Beverly tonight hoping she'd enjoy watching little Lisa play violin. She never could have imagined that her quiet, humble neighbor would end up being the most incredible performer of the entire evening. Mrs. Chen felt proud and grateful and amazed all at the same time, like she'd discovered a hidden treasure that had been right next door all along. The community center director had completely abandoned her duties and was standing near the front of the room, recording everything on her phone. In 30 years of organizing community events, she'd never seen anything like this. She was already thinking about how to convince Beverly to perform at future events, maybe even start a music program at the center. This kind of talent didn't come along very often, and when it did, you had to find ways to share it with as many people as possible. Beverly's music began telling a different story now, something that spoke of struggle and perseverance. The melody became more complex, with layers that seemed to represent different challenges and different ways of overcoming them. Her hands moved across the keyboard like they were having their own conversation about hard times and better days, about dreams deferred but never abandoned. A young mother who'd brought her twin daughters to watch the talent show found herself thinking about her own abandoned dreams. She'd played piano as a child, had even been pretty good at it, but life had gotten in the way. Watching Beverly play was reminding her that it might not be too late to find her way back to music. The twins, meanwhile, were sitting perfectly, still for the first time all evening, completely mesmerized by the sounds coming from the corner. The elderly gentleman who'd been impressed by Beverly's technical skill was now recognizing something even more important. This wasn't just someone who could play piano well. This was someone who understood music at a level that couldn't be taught in any classroom. She was communicating emotions and experiences through her playing that went far beyond mere entertainment. She was sharing pieces of her soul with everyone in the room. Beverly moved into what seemed like it might be her final section, and the music became even more powerful. She was pulling sounds out of that broken piano that shouldn't have been possible, finding ways to make every working key count for more than it normally would. Her playing had a quality that made people feel like they were witnessing something historic, a moment they'd remember and talk about for years to come. The 4 college students were learning lessons they'd never expected to learn on a random Tuesday night at a community talent show. Jessica was thinking about all the times she'd made assumptions about people based on appearances, all the opportunities she might have missed because she'd been too quick to judge. The weight of what they'd tried to do was settling on all of them like a heavy blanket. One of the other girls in their group was remembering her grandmother, who used to tell her stories about growing up in the South, about talented people who never got the recognition they deserved because of the color of their skin. She'd always thought those stories were ancient history, but watching Beverly play was making her realize that talent and prejudice still existed side by side, even in her supposedly progressive college town. Beverly's music reached a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone in the room, building to a moment of pure musical joy that made people want to stand up and cheer. But then, just as unexpectedly, she brought it back down to something quiet and intimate, like she was sharing a secret with each person individually. The contrast was breathtaking, showing a range of expression that left no doubt about her abilities. People throughout the room were having their own personal moments with Beverly's music. A man who'd been laid off from his job 3 months ago found hope in the melodies. A woman going through a difficult divorce heard strength in the rhythm. A teenager worried about college applications felt reassurance in the way Beverly made something beautiful out of broken pieces. The broken piano, which had been scheduled for disposal, was producing the most beautiful music anyone in that room had ever heard live. Beverly had found a way to make its flaws into features, its limitations into opportunities for creativity. She was showing everyone present that excellence doesn't require perfect conditions, that sometimes the most amazing things happen when you work with what you have, instead of waiting for what you think you need. As Beverly moved toward what was clearly going to be the ending of her performance, the entire room held its breath, not wanting this magical moment to end, but knowing it had to. The 4 college students stood frozen, dreading the moment when the music would stop and they'd have to face what they'd done. Beverly brought her hands to rest on the keys for the final time, letting the last note ring out into the silent room. For a moment that felt like it lasted forever. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The community center was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Then the applause started. It began with the elderly gentleman in the front row, who stood up slowly and began clapping with tears streaming down his face. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering like they'd just witnessed something miraculous, and in many ways they had. The applause wasn't polite community theater clapping. This was the kind of thunderous appreciation usually reserved for concert halls and professional venues. People were whistling, shouting bravo, and wiping tears from their eyes. Some folks were clapping so hard their hands were turning red. Beverly turned around on the wobbly piano bench, and for the first time all evening, she looked genuinely surprised. She'd gotten lost in the music and forgotten about the audience, forgotten about the college kids and their prank, forgotten about everything except the conversation she was having with that broken old piano. Now, seeing all these people on their feet cheering for her, she felt a mixture of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. The 4 college students stood frozen in the middle of all this celebration. While everyone around them was clapping and cheering, they looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Jessica's face had gone completely pale, and she was staring at Beverly with an expression of pure horror at what they'd tried to do. But Beverly, being the gracious person she was, simply stood up and gave a small bow to the room. She wasn't acting like a victim or making the college kids feel worse than they already did. She just accepted the applause with the dignity of someone who'd earned every bit of it. Mrs. Chen was pushing through the crowd, practically running toward Beverly, with little Lisa right behind her. When she reached her neighbor, she grabbed Beverly's hands and started speaking in a mixture of English and Chinese, tears of joy and pride streaming down her face. Lisa looked up at Beverly with wide eyes and said, "Miss Beverly, I didn't know. You could play like that. That was better than anything on YouTube." The community center director was right behind them, still holding her phone and looking like she'd just witnessed a miracle. "Beverly," she said, slightly out of breath from excitement, "I had no idea. I mean, I've lived in this town for 15 years, and I had no idea we had someone with your talent living right here. Would you consider teaching lessons here? Or performing at our other events? I mean, after what we just heard, I think the whole community would be thrilled to have you involved." More people were gathering around Beverly now. The woman who'd been knitting was holding Beverly's arm and telling her how the music had reminded her of her late husband. The teenager who'd put away his phone was asking if she had any recordings he could listen to. The young mother with twins was inquiring about piano lessons for her daughters. Through all of this, Beverly remained humble and gracious, answering questions and accepting compliments with the same quiet dignity she'd shown all evening. She explained that she'd studied classical piano in college, had even considered making it her career, but life had taken her in different directions. She'd been teaching elementary school for 20 years and playing piano at her church on Sundays, but she'd never really thought about performing publicly again. Meanwhile, the 4 college students were having their own reckoning. Jessica finally worked up the courage to approach Beverly, though she had to wait in line behind all the people who wanted to congratulate her. When she finally got her chance, she looked like she might be sick. "Miss," Jessica started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. What I did, it was wrong. We thought We assumed. She couldn't finish the sentence because there was no way to explain their behavior that didn't make it sound exactly as terrible as it was. Beverly looked at Jessica for a long moment, and the young woman probably expected anger or a lecture about prejudice and assumptions. Instead, Beverly's expression was kind but serious. "Honey," she said gently, "I've been dealing with people's assumptions about me my whole life. The difference is, tonight you gotta see what happens when those assumptions are wrong. I hope you'll remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on what you think you know about them." Jessica nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I will. I promise I will. And I'm so sorry. You're incredible, and we could have—" She couldn't finish, but Beverly understood. "The important thing," Beverly said, placing a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder, "is that you learned something tonight. That's all any of us can do. Learn and do better next time." The other 3 college students had gathered the courage to join Jessica, and they all mumbled their own apologies, looking ashamed and amazed in equal measure. Beverly accepted their apologies with grace, treating them like young people who'd made a mistake rather than enemies who'd tried to humiliate her. As the evening wound down and people started gathering their things to leave, Beverly found herself surrounded by opportunities she hadn't expected. The community center director had formally asked her to consider starting a music program. 3 different people had requested private lessons for their children. Someone from the local arts council who'd been in the audience had approached her about performing at the upcoming cultural festival. Mrs. Chen was practically glowing with pride as she helped Beverly gather her coat and purse. "I knew you were special," she kept saying, "but I had no idea how special. The whole neighborhood is going to be so proud when I tell them what happened tonight." Little Lisa was still buzzing with excitement, asking Beverly question after question about how she learned to play, how long she'd been practicing, whether the broken keys made it harder or easier. Beverly answered each question patiently, encouraging Lisa to keep practicing her violin and reminding her that music was about expression, not perfection. As they walked toward the parking lot, Beverly reflected on how the evening had unfolded. She'd come to support a neighbor's child and ended up rediscovering a part of herself she'd almost forgotten. The broken piano that was supposed to embarrass her had instead reminded her why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. The community center director had already called the local newspaper, and by the next morning there would be a story about the incredible performance that had transformed a routine talent show into something extraordinary. The broken piano, which had been scheduled for disposal, would be carefully restored and become the centerpiece of the new music program that Beverly would eventually agree to lead. But perhaps most importantly, 4 young people had learned a lesson about assumptions and prejudice that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They'd tried to set up what they thought would be an easy target for their amusement, and instead they discovered that talent and dignity can flourish in the most unexpected places. As Beverly drove home that night, she found herself humming the melodies she'd played, already thinking about what she might teach her first students when the music program started. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful things really do come from working with broken pieces and making them whole again.